Our next method, like I said, is metaphor criticism, which investigates how rhetors and artifacts use metaphors to make meaning, shape audiences' understandings of the topics they address, and influence attitudes, beliefs, values, and actions. So, hopefully, you're beginning to see connections among the various methods that we've covered so far. You can think about metaphor criticism as a new method that draws from elements of our previous methods. So, Neo-Aristotelian criticism drew our attention to the canon of style, and metaphor is a specific type of stylistic device. Generic criticism drew our attention to patterns in substance and style among different artifacts that address and emerge from similar contexts and rhetorical situations. And here we'll identify common patterns or types of metaphors. And lastly, ideological criticism focused on how rhetoric and power go hand in hand to influence our attitudes, beliefs, values, assumptions, norms, and expectations. We'll look at the relationship between metaphor and ideology and think through some examples of powerful metaphors. All right. So, what are metaphors? We're all pretty familiar with metaphors because we encounter them on an everyday basis. And you probably remember learning about them in elementary school. To begin conceptualizing metaphors, Foss gives us this definition. Metaphors are non literal comparisons in which a word or phrase from one domain of experience is applied to a different domain. And just for the record, although you probably spent some time learning how to distinguish metaphors from similes back in the day, those distinctions aren't super important here. Foss's definition of metaphor encompasses a range of metaphor esque comparisons, such as similes and analogies. So there are at least two levels of comparison at play when rhetors use metaphors. The first is pretty direct. When we use metaphors, we make or imply connections between characteristics of what we're talking about and characteristics of something else. For example, in the phrase, my roommate is a pig, we're comparing characteristics of my roommate to characteristics of a pig. So the second level of comparison is more abstract and contextual. In the phrase, my roommate is a pig, we're not only comparing my roommate to a pig, but we're implying that there's some connection between the domestic behavior of some humans, like messy roommates, and the behavior of messy farm animals, for example, pigs. So the underlying logic, oh, going back here. All right. So the underlying logic in the use of metaphors is that the two things being compared are similar enough to warrant the comparison, but different enough that the comparison is creative and interesting. Using metaphors helps us to see things in different ways. Here we go. All right, going back here. So, the components of metaphors. So, in addition to there being two levels of comparison at play in the use of metaphors, there are also two components to metaphors at each level. So, at the direct level of comparison that applies characteristics of one thing to characteristics of the thing we're talking about, the two components are called the tenor and the vehicle. So, the tenor of a metaphor is the thing we're trying to explain. The vehicle of a metaphor is a thing that we're using to illustrate what we're trying to explain, almost like a lens. So, in the phrase, my roommate is a pig, how would you identify the tenor and vehicle? In my roommate is a pig, the tenor, or what we're trying to explain with the use of this metaphor, is my roommate. Um, in the vehicle, or the thing we're using to illustrate my roommate, is a pig. So, in the phrase, my roommate is a pig, there's a pretty clear and complete metaphor presented. Often, though, rhetorical artifacts will use metaphors in much more complex ways. So, the vehicle might be present while the tenor is just implied. So, think about the phrase battle of the sexes. There's still a pretty clear metaphor here, but the tenor and vehicle relationship isn't quite as obvious. So, how might you identify the tenor and vehicle in this metaphor? In Battle of the Sexes, battle is working as the vehicle, but the tenor isn't really the sexes. What's really being represented by battle here then? It's the relationship between people of different sexes and or genders, which is implied but not entirely explicitly present in that phrase. So you can't just assume that a metaphor will just be super clear cut and fully present within a piece of rhetoric or a rhetorical artifact. Metaphor criticism asks you to engage in an in-depth exploration of how metaphors are making meaning, which is typically more complicated than just identifying the components of what's being said or shown to us. So, what I'm trying to say here then is that in this particular example, my roommate is a pig. Pretty clear cut, pretty simple, pretty obvious. It's not always going to be that way, though, especially when we look at more complex artifacts, right? Another important thing that I'm trying to point out here is that metaphor criticism is much more than just identifying the tenor and vehicle and calling it a day. While that is a component, there is much more to metaphor criticism than just identifying those components. It's also not just about identifying a metaphor, right? So if you were engaging in metaphor criticism and watching a speech, it's not enough to just say, here are four metaphors. That's not actually the work of metaphor criticism. Metaphor criticism is about identifying and understanding and analyzing metaphors to see how they are making meaning. And we'll continue to think through this with a few more examples. All right, so metaphor and context. Um, Whereas the tenor and vehicle really refer directly to the direct comparison being made by the metaphor, there are also two components to the contextual connections implied by metaphors. So the first being the target domain. The target domain refers to the conceptual domain or context that we're trying to understand, whereas source domain refers to the conceptual domain or context that we're trying to understand. So this is kind of like tenor and vehicle, except more abstract. All right. So note that the FOSS chapter seems to suggest that the tenor and target domain are the same, and the vehicle and source domain are the same. But in practice, though, it's often possible to actually make a distinction. They're not always the same, as FOSS would imply. So think of the target and source domains as moving up one level of abstraction to consider the larger categories represented by the tenor and vehicle. So the target domain is connected to the tenor and the source domain is connected to the vehicle, but they're not exactly the same. All right, so we'll take this example again. My roommate is a pig. So in the phrase, my roommate is a pig, we said that roommate is the tenor and pig is the vehicle, right? Because tenor is a thing that we are trying to explain, which is the roommate. And the lens that we're using to explain that is the pig, which is the vehicle. So we can label the target domain of roommate as the target, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that if we're thinking about one level of abstraction, then what is one level up of abstraction of my roommate is a pig. So here it would be domestic human behavior. In other words, living with somebody else, being in the same household with them, right? So notice that this level of analysis is a lot more interpretive, right? Especially when we get to the source domain. So again, tenor and vehicle, we said that the roommate is a tenor and the vehicle is a pig. Here we're saying that the target domain is one level of abstraction up from roommate, and we're identifying this as domestic human behavior. So therefore, what would be one level up in abstraction to the vehicle, which is pig? In other words, what would the source domain be? Here, I'm saying that the source domain is farm animal behavior. In other words, some domestic human behavior, like roommates, are comparable to farm animal behavior. And in this example, pigs. So this level of analysis is, a lot more interpretive and it's open-ended. So there might be multiple ways to label the target and source domains of any given metaphor. So think carefully about the labels that you select and apply. And thinking about source domain and target domain will really help you to begin to categorize and label metaphors. And it makes it possible to identify connections across different artifacts using similar types of metaphors, which you'll see illustrated in the article on types of metaphors used to represent immigrants. Let's go back to the phrase, the battle of the sexes, though. If battle is the vehicle, it's really representing a larger target domain as the tenor. The tenor is not the sexes, but the relationship between different people of different sexes and or genders. So here, the distinction between tenor and target domain is less important, although you could still go up a level of abstraction for this tenor and identify the target domain as relationships between people with different identities, for example. So to label the source domain of the vehicle battle, consider what larger category or domain is represented. perhaps war or violent confrontation. And from here, you can really start to think about what metaphors do. What might be the implications of using metaphors of violent confrontation to shape people's understandings of relationships between people of different sexes and or genders? If we understand relationships among groups of people who are different through the lens of violent confrontation, then we're directed to think and act as if we're in a constant state of conflict with others, that there will be winners and losers, and that we should fight against one another rather than, say, working together. This example begins to gesture toward connections between metaphor and ideology, but we'll come back to that connection a little bit later. All right. So, as far as rhetorical perspectives on metaphor, we're going to take a step back from conceptualizing metaphors and their components. And right now, we're going to focus on the two different ways that rhetoricians have understood metaphor in the past and in a contemporary context. So, these are related to the two overarching perspectives on rhetoric that we've discussed back in the beginning of the semester, where we identified a traditional perspective on rhetoric as being grounded in the intentional use of spoken and written language to influence audiences, and then a contemporary perspective on rhetoric, which is the perspective that humans use symbols to communicate, right? So those are two different perspectives. And likewise, the different perspectives on metaphor are connected to these particular perspectives on rhetoric. So that contemporary perspective on rhetoric took on some nuance with generic and ideological criticism, where we saw how our use of symbols to communicate participates in the process of constructing our social realities. So a traditional perspective on metaphor is grounded in a traditional perspective on rhetoric, and it would be more closely related to the Neo-Aristotelian criticism's treatment of style. Where stylistic devices such as metaphor were understood as decorative or embellishments, and often were considered to get in the way of clear communication. From a traditional perspective on rhetoric, the use of metaphor should be limited to occasions in which a rhetor might need to use characteristics of something that's well known, vehicle, right, to help audiences understand something that's less understood or unknown, which would be the tenor. From this perspective, a rhetor first perceives reality and then gives it meaning. This is similar to Bitzer's perspective on the rhetorical situation, which we discussed a bit with generic criticism. And that's where rhetoric emerges in response to a pre existing rhetorical situation. Today, however, most rhetoricians have embraced a contemporary perspective on metaphor, where the use of metaphor participates in the construction and framing of our social realities. So, this perspective argues that there are an infinite array of metaphors for describing the same reality. Each metaphor produces a different description of the same reality, and therefore, each metaphor frames or guides the way we understand and act within those realities. And we'll come back to the concept of framing in our discussion of pentatic criticism, which is our next and last method. But for now, just know that frames or framing is a term used to describe how rhetoric shapes our understanding of topics and issues in some ways rather than others. So if you're working with a more traditional method, such as Neo-Aristotelian criticism, you can analyze metaphors from a more traditional perspective in your analysis of style or stylistic characteristics. But if you're working with the more contemporary method or perspective, really anything other than your Aristotelian criticism, including this method, you should be approaching your analysis of metaphor from a contemporary perspective that asks how the use of metaphors and the artifact you're analyzing work to construct understandings, attitudes, beliefs, values, and actions. In other words, metaphors are used to label a phenomenon, and they direct how we understand, experience, and respond to that phenomenon. And that is your task as a rhetorical critic using metaphor criticism, to not only identify the metaphors and label their components, but really to analyze, recognize, and understand how those metaphors shape our beliefs and, of course, our actions. So, metaphors can also be made without words, right? Metaphors don't just need to appear in spoken and written communication. They also appear in the rhetorical use of images and visual symbols. So Foss identifies three types of visual metaphors for us. Note that this discussion is buried in her discussion of the steps of metaphor criticism, so you may have missed it when you were reading the chapter. I'll give you the names and definitions of these three types of visual metaphors, and then we'll look at some examples. So, substitution metaphors were the first. And that is when you substitute one thing, usually the tenor, for the other, which is the vehicle, to communicate metaphoric meaning. In other words, only the tenor or the vehicle are explicitly present in the visual metaphor. The second type is fusion. So fusion metaphors put two things in combination with one another. The tenor and the vehicle are basically both partially present, and they're combined or fused together to make meaning. And the third type of visual metaphor that Foss labels for us is called juxtaposition. So juxtaposition metaphors put two things in contrast with one another. So for this, the tenor and the vehicle are both fully present, but they're separate, and usually for a purpose. In other words, to juxtapose them, right? To contrast them. So let's take a look at some examples to illustrate these various types of visual metaphors. All right, so the first that we're going to go through is a pretty famous painting of Frida Kahlo. Some of you might be familiar with it and some of you might not. It is called The Broken Column, and she painted it in 1944. So what do you see here? I see Frida Kahlo. She looks like she's crying. There are nails embedded throughout her body, not just her face, but her arms and just all over. She's also seems like she's in pain. Her eyes, I think, communicate some pain, some suffering. And she's wrapped in this sort of brace, like a back brace. She's in a desert, which, looks kind of desolate and isolated. And of course, most strikingly, her spine seems to be broken. Her spine seems to be actually replaced with a column, right? A broken column, and it looks cracked. It's like a historical looking column if you look closely. So here then Kahlo replaces her spine with an ancient architectural column that's been broken and cracked in several places. So what is the context for this? This is what I ask you almost every single time when we do method application exercises or essays. And the context is always important because otherwise you're not really fully understanding the artifact. There are things that you might miss. So the context here is that when Kahlo was a teenager, she was actually in a devastating bus accident that left her bedridden and in pain and suffering for a very long time. And throughout her life, she experienced chronic pain. It was actually then, when she was bedridden and trying to recover, that she really took up painting to express all of her feelings. So obviously, it communicates pain and suffering, both physical and mental pain. So given all of this, then, what type of visual metaphor is represented? Substitution, right? Because one thing is substituted for the other. Either the tenor or the vehicle is absent. So to figure out which one is absent, you have to label the components. If the metaphor is my spine is like a broken column, then the vehicle is the broken column and the tenor is the spine, because the spine is a thing that we're trying to explain, and the vehicle is the sort of lens that we're using to describe it in a different way. Therefore, this would be a visual metaphor of substitution. Let's continue with a different example though. So here's a little bit more of one without any context or explanation. So check it out. First, you should describe what you see, right? And then you should ask, what type of visual metaphor do you think is being used here? What is the tenor and what is the vehicle? And what meaning is this metaphor communicating? So in this image, we see a rolled up dollar bill stuffed with what appears to be tobacco being held between a person's fingers. The rolled up dollar bill is being lit with the flame from a lighter. And remember to always start with description and then move on to your analysis. So what kind of visual metaphor is this then? Just like the Frida Kahlo image, it is a substitution metaphor. in which a dollar bill, which is the vehicle, represents a cigarette, which is the tenor, right? So it's being substituted. Instead of a cigarette, it's a dollar bill. We can tell it's a substitution metaphor because the thing that's being represented, which is a cigarette, in other words, the tenor, is not actually present in the image. It's actually substituted by the vehicle, which is the dollar bill. We can interpret the tenor as a cigarette based on how it's being held, what appears to be inside of it, and the way it's being lit. To interpret the meaning of this image, we'd think about what is being represented by this substitution. So here, this image seems to suggest that smoking cigarettes is like taking your money and lighting it on fire. So we might interpret this image as arguing that smoking cigarettes is a waste of money. Note that there are many possible alternative ways to understand the problems with smoking cigarettes. This image argues that smoking cigarettes is a waste of money, but we could also talk about how smoking cigarettes is bad for your health, bad for the environment, a gateway to other drugs, and so on and so forth. But this image in particular is communicating the meaning that smoking cigarettes is a complete waste of your money. It's like lighting your own money on fire. Let's take a look at another example then. All right, so do the same thing with this image. Look at it, describe what you see, and then ask, what type of visual metaphor do you think is being used here? What is the tenor and what is the vehicle? And what meaning is this metaphor communicating? So in this image, we see a round, multicolored object. I see blue, brown, white, green, and it seems to be dripping onto a tan textured cone. As a whole, this seems to be an image of a strangely colored ice cream cone. Based on the presentation of this image, it seems that the round multicolored object on the top is a representation of the earth. So this would be a fusion metaphor in which the ice cream cone, which is the vehicle, represents a melting or warming earth, which would be the tenor. We can tell it's a fusion metaphor because both the tenor and the vehicle are present in the image and they're combined or fused together. So the meaning of this image seems to be that the earth is getting warm and melting like an ice cream cone on a hot summer day. This fusion metaphor connects to the larger target domain of global climate change. This image suggests that if global climate change persists unchecked, the earth will melt away. But also, hope is not lost, and we might be able to do something to help prevent further melting or damage. And let's do one more example. All right, so one more time, describe what you see and then ask yourself, what type of visual metaphor do you think is being used here? What's a tenor, what's the vehicle, and what meaning is this metaphor communicating? So in this image, we see a picture of a cute kitten and a cute baby chick alongside text that reads, "Why love one but eat the other? Choose vegetarian." There are also a couple of websites and the logo for Mercy for Animals, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to non-human animal rights. This would be a juxtaposition metaphor, where the baby chick, which is the tenor, is juxtaposed to the kitten, which is the vehicle. The text asks a rhetorical question, which prompts us to consider the comparison implied between the target domain, farm animals that we consume, and the source domain, which is domestic animals that we keep as pets. By analyzing the images and the text in this example, we can interpret the meaning of this image, which suggests that it's strange that we eat some animals and yet we love others. It helps that both animals here that are, relatively cute, which perhaps makes them lovable. But the argument here seems to be, if you love animals, you shouldn't eat them. All right, so let's move on then. So you can probably see how the previous three examples might be connected to ideology. Each example attempted to shape our understandings of some phenomenon in ways that influence our attitudes, our beliefs, our values, and our actions. So Foss tells us that metaphors tend to function ideologically. Metaphors implicitly communicate, quote, assumptions, points of view, and evaluations. They organize attitudes toward whatever they describe and provide motives for acting in certain ways. Metaphors are often used in ways that normalize particular attitudes, beliefs, values, and or actions to support dominant ideologies. And let's look at some examples to help illustrate this. So in the first, the phrase time is money, we have a direct comparison between time, which is the tenor, and money, which is the vehicle. So what larger ideology do you think the metaphor time is money might support? And again, remember what ideologies are. Lots of things that end in isms. And in this particular instance, the ideology that's being presented is capitalism. So, what are some of the ways that the metaphor time is money might structure our everyday lives? Perhaps this type of metaphor directs us to think and act as if our time should be spent. Hey, another money metaphor. So, in ways that will pay off, and there's another one. So, there are a lot of metaphors in this larger cluster of metaphoric associations between time and money. So, some related metaphors would be like, this gadget will save you hours. I have to budget my time. I've invested a lot of time into this relationship. This better pay off. You're wasting my time, etc. And we're really guided by this metaphor in ways that we really tend to take for granted. So, for example, most of us get paid by the hour, and many of us pay for things by increments of time, hourly, monthly, yearly subscriptions. Productivity is often understood as what we're able to accomplish within a set amount of time. And value is often understood as what we get out of what we spend within a particular amount of time. Let's look at another one. Our city is infested with homeless people. So here the vehicle is infestation, which is being used to represent both homeless people and the city in which they live. This phrase suggests that characteristics of infestation can be applied to people experiencing homelessness. So think about what infestation is typically used to describe: bugs, rodents, or other pests, or perhaps even diseases. So statements like this suggest that homeless people are diseased, dangerous, and encroaching on our space. This type of metaphor frames people experiencing homelessness as the problem, not our housing laws and policies or a capitalist system in which some people are ridiculously wealthy and some people can't even afford food or shelter. And this type of metaphor has some pretty significant implications. Remember, I always ask you to think about the implications. Another word for implications would be consequences. So think about what we tend to do when we have an infestation of pests. We don't typically find them a new place to live, right? We try to get rid of them. So when we have metaphors like this that are constantly circulating within our public discourse, our attitudes and actions toward homeless people are shaped in ways that suggest that homeless people are a problem that we should get rid of. Lastly, in this phrase, immigrants are invading our country. We have immigrants, which is the tenor, represented through a metaphor of invasion, which is the vehicle. The word invasion tends to be used in military contexts, where an unwelcomed group comes into a territory by force. So when we understand immigration through the lens of invasion, then we're positioned to believe that immigrants are hostile, that they're coming in to take over and or cause destruction, and that we should work to keep them out in order to protect ourselves. This type of perspective makes it pretty difficult to embrace other ways of understanding immigrants, such as people attempting to seek a better life for themselves and their families, or people who are seeking refuge from persecution. So think back to your analysis and your practice using ideological criticism. Can you think of any metaphors that were meaningful in your artifact's construction of ideology? So, in particular, thinking about that commercial, there were other metaphors, and there are other metaphors that exist to describe immigrants in different ways and perhaps more compassionate ways. And as Foss points out, when we think in different ways or shift our metaphors, we're able to shift our thinking and our perspectives. And oftentimes, shifting our perspectives is necessary to think differently, act differently, and imagine and create a better world. So, speaking of resistance, when we talk about hegemony and dominant ideologies, we also talked about resistance. So, similarly, metaphors aren't only used to support dominant ideologies, they can also be used strategically to resist dominant beliefs, values, assumptions, norms, and expectations. And here's the quotation I was invoking a little bit earlier. Quote, shifting metaphors means changing perspectives, making new connections, and seeing in new ways. So Foss tells us that the first step in using metaphors as a form of resistance is to change the terms. Stop using the language of the dominant metaphor and shift to an alternative frame slash vehicle. So, part of what metaphor criticism invites us to do is to expose dominant metaphors and investigate how they're making meaning and promoting problematic beliefs, values, assumptions, and actions. We might also examine or even propose the use of alternative metaphors. Think about these shifts from the examples on the last slide. What happens when we stop seeing time as money and start seeing it as a gift? Or when we stop understanding homeless people as pests and instead think about the lack of affordable housing as an epidemic? Or when we shift from thinking about immigrants as invaders and understand immigrants as woven into the very fabric of the United States? In each case, our attitudes and values shift, and especially on a societal level, our actions can shift too. This just illustrates the shifting of metaphors and the way in which it's not too difficult to resist those dominant metaphors by shifting to more compassionate ones. All right, so have you ever really thought about how common violent metaphors are? Have you ever stopped to think about just how many violent metaphors we hear and use on an everyday basis? So the ones I'm going to list here are just a few, but you can identify others, I'm sure. So when we say these things, they seem innocent enough. Nobody's actually killing birds with stones, right? So what's the problem then? So here you see battle of the sexes, caught in the crossfire, demolished by my opponent, kill two birds with one stone, crushed her dreams, shot holes in his argument, smoking gun, biting the bullet, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on women, etc. Don't shoot the messenger. Ground zero, you dropped a bomb. The tweet blew up. She's a feminazi. He's a grammar Nazi. You're a social justice warrior. ExxonMobil is raping the environment, which is a terrible thing to say, but these are things that we hear quite often. So, as innocent as these metaphors might seem on their own, when we have so many different types of violent metaphors being used so frequently, violence itself becomes more normalized and even glorified. So, pay attention to what you say and hear over the next couple of weeks and see if you notice these and other violent metaphors being used. Chances are you will. All right. So, when it comes to doing metaphor criticism, what types of artifacts might work best? Um, as with our previous two methods, there are many possibilities. You should choose an artifact that has some clear metaphoric component, although we might appreciate that virtually any type of communication can be understood as metaphorical. But it's easiest to do metaphor criticism when you have an artifact that contains an explicit metaphor, at least partially. So, some common types of artifacts for metaphor criticism include things like speeches, propaganda, advocacy campaigns, commercials and advertisements, BuzzFeed or social media videos, films, political cartoons, and so on. I would suggest that if you wanted to use metaphor criticism for your final essay, to look for an interesting advocacy campaign to analyze, because advocacy campaigns take a stand for or against something, and often they use metaphors to take that stand creatively, as with the earlier examples of visual metaphors, like the anti smoking one or the global climate change, the ice cream cone, or the veganism one or vegetarianism one with mercy for animals. So, advocacy campaigns tend to include a visual element instead of or in addition to linguistic metaphors. Um, so, like anti smoking campaigns, anti drug campaigns, those are quite interesting usually. Campaigns for or against abortion, vegan slash vegetarian campaigns, environmental justice campaigns, etc. And it's really interesting to think about how important social justice issues are represented metaphorically and what those metaphoric representations do to influence audiences. So, those are all excellent artifacts. Moving on, how to apply metaphor criticism to an artifact. Well, Foss gives us 4 steps for doing metaphor criticism. It's important to remember that ultimately the goal of metaphor criticism is to examine and interpret what metaphors do to influence audiences' understandings, attitudes, beliefs, values, and or actions. So, although these steps largely focus on identifying and interpreting the metaphors used, you always want to be doing so with an eye toward thinking about how these metaphors are functioning. So, again, metaphor criticism is not just, oh, look at this Taylor Swift song. I found five metaphors. That's not metaphor criticism, right? Um, it's not enough. And as always, with this class, with every method, the best metaphors the best artifacts are the ones that are connected to a larger social issue. That is when we can really see what is happening. What are these metaphors actually doing, and how are they influencing the world in important or significant ways? So, step one here is to examine the artifact as a whole. And as always, you would begin by familiarizing yourself with your artifact by using descriptive analysis. Then you would examine the larger context of your artifact. So, calling your roommate a pig constructs a different meaning from calling a law enforcement officer a pig. Context is incredibly important when interpreting the meaning and significance of metaphors. And as always, you'll establish the larger context of your artifact in the opening paragraph of your essay or the first question in your method application exercise, and you should make connections back to that context in your analysis if you're writing an essay. So the second piece would be to zoom in to focus on the metaphors used in your artifact and identify their components. So remember that often only a part of the metaphor will be explicitly present in your artifact, whether verbally or visually. Battle of the Sexes uses the vehicle of battle, but it leaves the tenor of relationship among people of different sexes or genders implied. It's not obvious right away. Aliens are invading our country and stealing our jobs. That uses the vehicle of alien to imply a tenor of immigrants. Again, it's just not obvious. Or coming out of the closet. That constructs a metaphor that implicitly references an LGBTQ person disclosing their sexuality. But again, all of those are implicit. They're obvious metaphors, but their components might not be completely obvious at first. Third would be to try to identify patterns or connections in the types of metaphors used in your artifact. So, if you want to investigate how a Trump speech uses metaphors to talk about immigration, you would likely focus on the multiple vehicles used to represent immigrants and immigration. But if you wanted to investigate how a Frank Ocean song uses metaphors to represent the larger topic of losing love, you'd likely be looking at many different tenor or vehicle pairings that work together to communicate something about the experience of losing love. Think about what types of metaphors are used frequently and which metaphors seem to do the most important or significant rhetorical work, which is intensity. Perhaps because it's provocative, unexpected, or extra powerful. But you can use those two um, oof, I just went far back. You can use those two principles of frequency and intensity to figure out which metaphors are most significant. And then lastly, you would need to develop an explanation, right? So you would use your findings from the steps 1 through 3 to develop an explanation for how the metaphors used in your artifact are inviting audiences to understand the concept, topic, or situation addressed by your artifact. You'll make a clear argument for the overall rhetorical function of these metaphors in your conclusion, and that would be your thesis statement, right? Because a thesis statement answers the research question. And if you're kind of like, oh, I don't remember that, that is from our very first lecture on FOSS chapters 1 and 2, and will become more important when it comes to your final paper. But make sure that your key claims in your analysis build up to your conclusion. So for the sake of the method application exercise, then steps 1 through 3 will be important, but they're going to be explicitly asked in the questions themselves. All right. As far as formulating a research question, so I will cover this and then that'll be the last slide. So first of all, FOSS provides a couple of options depending on what you want to focus on in your analysis, but they essentially boil down to these guiding questions. And remember that the question should address what the metaphors uncovered in your artifact do. It's not enough to just say, I found a metaphor. The work of rhetorical criticism is explaining, examining, analyzing what those things are doing, right? Just like it wouldn't be enough to say, hey, this artifact has an ideology of feminism. Great, but why? For what purpose? What does it do? How is it influencing audiences? There are so many other questions, so many other things. And that's why I say it's important to dig deeper. So, one of the guiding questions would be, what vehicle does this artifact use to create meaning for this topic or tenor? And what are the implications of these metaphoric associations? What metaphors does this artifact use to create meaning for this topic? And what are the implications of these metaphoric associations? So, when you're thinking about the implications of an artifact's use of metaphors, ask how the metaphors used invite audiences to understand the topic or situation described. And these are the two guiding questions that can help you do that. So, as a whole, your metaphor criticism essay should interpret the metaphors present in or suggested by your artifact in ways that reveal how those metaphors construct an understanding of the thing, topic, or situation that they describe, and how audiences' attitudes, beliefs, values, and/or actions might be influenced in the process. So, important to take away here then is to examine the metaphors, but to take a step back to make sure that we follow the steps in the sense that we should examine the artifact as a whole first. And I always ask you to do that, right? To watch it, to read it on its own. Then consider the questions that I'm asking you, which will be to isolate some of the metaphors in the artifact that I'm going to provide, to identify the tenors and vehicles, right, which are the most important components of a metaphor. And they could be verbal or visual, whatever you find is significant. Um, and then you would sort the metaphors, try to categorize them and label them. And you can use the principles of frequency and intensity to figure out which metaphors seem to you to be the most significant. And then the most important piece of all, as I keep harping on, is to develop an explanation for how the metaphors are functioning rhetorically. How do they invite us to understand that concept, topic, or situation? So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you'll be able to understand and see metaphors in a brand new way, especially considering that we tend to speak in terms of metaphor and especially violent metaphors all the time in ways that just go beyond our conscious recognition. So pay attention to how politicians, leaders, yourself, your friends, and family speak in terms of metaphor. And often when you start looking for something, you'll find it everywhere.